Hi, my name is Chris Lastovicka, and I am presenting on the role of XML in information retrieval, particularly with the advances in semantic XML retrieval. First, I will talk about what XML is, a little bit about the history of XML, problems in XML retrieval in general, what semantic XML is, problems in semantic XML retrieval, and finally talk about the paper I'm focusing on, which comes up with a new framework for semantic XML retrieval that they've called XSDF. What is XML? It stands for Extensible Markup Language. The World Wide Web Consortium, which was started by Tim Berners-Lee, who started the web, invented HTML. This is the de facto standards organization for many things related to the web, including XML. XML uses elements and trees with data inside it, much like HTML, to label and structure this data. But unlike HTML, you can come up with your own tags. For example, on the left side of the screen, this is the markup. You've got the root element, bookstore. Then you have a sub-element, book. It has an attribute called category. And then sub-elements that are siblings of each other, title, author, year, and price. So the programmer came up with these labels themselves. This isn't like HTML, where you're dealing with preset element labels like div or p for paragraph. Then on the right is the XML tree, and this tree reflects the elements on the left. So you can see the root element bookstore at the top of the tree and how it's a parent of the book. Then the book has children, which are siblings of each other, title, author, year, price. And then the leaves of the tree are the text inside those elements. These are also nodes, by the way, which is a term I will be using later on. A lot of what we've been, well, most, if not all of what we've been studying in class is information retrieval that deals with unstructured data, like text documents. Relational databases are highly structured. XML is technically considered semi-structured, but many people refer to it as structured. The history of XML is kind of interesting. Like I said, Tim Berners-Lee started out coming up with markup language for the World Wide Web. Something called Standard Generalized Markup Language was one of the first markup languages, and then it was reworked into XML in 1998. So XML has been around for a long time. HTML, XML, SGML, they're all markup languages, which means we're marking up data with labels, tags. We're not using this information to program. We're not programming with this information. We may write programs to deal with that information, though, which is done all the time. Since XML's been around since 1998, naturally, XML retrieval research started around the same time, in the late 1990s. But it wasn't until 2002 that an actual bona fide designated evaluation test collection and measures and models for testing XML retrieval was developed. And that's called the Initiative for Evaluation of XML Retrieval, known as INEX or INEX. I don't know how to pronounce it. The main difference between the information retrieval we've been studying in class is that information retrieval with unstructured text, we're dealing with retrieving documents. Whereas with XML retrieval, we're looking for the most relevant elements or components. XML retrieval follows a similar process as the retrieval for unstructured data. XML has querying languages, and they create requests that have constraints to bring back the components to be retrieved. In indexing, it's indexing units. The ranking ranks by variability of granularity of these components. The results are presented in an organized way, optimally, hopefully, for the user and the user interface. And then I only know of the INEX test collection, but that's what is used in evaluating and what the authors of the research paper I'm focused on in this presentation, what they use for evaluation. Semantic XML is the meaning. Semantics means meaning. So we're looking for being able to extract meaningful information from the XML so that, for example, if we're querying something, there's more understanding from the system. If we have a polysemic word, we can tell more from context, that sort of thing. However, XML, because there's so much flexibility in programmers being able to choose what they name elements, how they label them, there isn't some kind of semantic governance rule book. That means a programmer could maybe not spend so much time in thinking about the most meaningful labels for content, and it can cause some problems down the road for retrieval. And in fact, you have to use another tool like this resource description framework that we know as RDF to map information to elements that don't have meaning. That's one way of dealing with it. But say you don't have that. What if your XML does not have clear meaning and it's not mapped to RDF? Then it's not really very semantic. Some of the problems in semantic XML retrieval are what I just talked about, that there's what's called semantic disambiguation. And that means the terms are not clearly defined. It's not easy to tell what some of these terms mean. Some of the reason for this is that the terms have multiple meanings. You could have multiple terms that are different, but they have the same meaning. Some terms are implied by other terms. And in the language, in lexical ambiguity, terms in lexical language, this is homonymy, metonymy, synonymy. There is a model called word sense disambiguation, known as WSD, that has been used, that's studied for the unstructured text, but not so much for XML structured text. Some of the previous research in XML, in Semantic XML, has extended these flat text studies, but ignored some of the facets of XML that make XML unique. Most of the semantic analysis for XML so far has had a few limitations, such as instead of just focusing on nodes that have the most ambiguity and lack of clarity of meaning, these methods focus on all of the nodes. Sometimes the semantic analysis considers only certain types of node relationships, like parent-child, but not other relationships. And a third issue is that it may completely ignore the structural features, the labels, well, not the labels, but how the structure is put together, and focusing only on the syntactic techniques, like taking everything, making it into, or using the bag of words paradigm. Here are two documents that are using some of the same information and content, but presenting it differently, using different labels and elements. For example, right at the root element, at the top you see films on the left. In document 2, it's movies is the root element. So there we have two different terms with the same meaning. And you might say, well, films is polysemic. Which films are we talking about? Movie films? Photographic films? We don't know. But then we have a sub-element in document 1, picture. And if you go down a little further, you see cast in document 1, polysemic word. Broken arm cast. What kind of cast are we talking about? In document 2, we have actors. So you can see how labels can change depending on who is defining these labels. Now we will talk about the actual article that is coming up, that came up with a new way of retrieving Semantic XML, a new framework for this, called XSDF. That's what they've named it. XML Semantic Disambiguation Framework. And their objective is to turn the syntactic XML trees into meaningful XML trees. I'm going to go back a slide. This is from the article Resolving XML Semantic Ambiguity by researchers Charbel, Tekli, Jabir, and Tekli. In their model, they first figure out which nodes are ambiguous. So instead of the previous techniques of dealing with all of the nodes, they just want to find the ones that have issues with ambiguity. There are semantic networks like WordNet that they can use as a third party to try to figure out how to disambiguate these terms, which they do in their framework. Then they use something called a sphere neighborhood context model, because they find that the distance of terms one from another has an effect on semantics and figuring out what the meaning is. And then in their process, they represent this using vectors, just as we've done in class with our vector models. This is all part of the context-based semantic disambiguation. The sphere neighborhood and the vector representation is part of the context. And finally, they use semantic similarity measures to come up with their final semantic XML tree. This is their design model of the process. And if you look at the bottom left, that's the XML doc. And first, like most of what we've talked about in class, it goes through a pre-processing. There's tokenization, deals with the stop words, stems words, and then the XML tree is parsed. And then in the upper left, this is where tools like the semantic network WordNet are used to figure out which nodes have the most ambiguity and to take those nodes and get them to be set up for disambiguation, to clarify the meanings of those nodes. Then we get to this fun part, the upper right, of the context with the sphere neighborhood, which we'll talk about next, which is pretty cool, and then the context vector representation, which is showing you the weights of these terms. And finally, we get to the semantic disambiguation with the similarity measures to create, finally, a semantic XML tree. Here is a diagram of the sphere neighborhoods. So in this diagram, the target node is cast. On the left, there is a circle around cast that is a ring, literally. This ring is a distance of 1 from the cast node. And you can see that one child distance is star, and there's another star. And then 1 up to the parent is picture. On the right-hand side, we have a sphere with a distance of 2 from our target term cast. 2 means if you go up from cast to the parent picture and its parent films, that's 2. 2 children down from cast, you go to stars, 1, and then Stewart is 2. So this is how it's determining terms and distance. And then you can build the vector representation. So the one at the top is of that diagram on the left where we only had 1 distance. So we only have cast, picture, and star. Vector number 2 on the bottom, we're dealing with the sphere that had a distance of 2 from our target term cast. So we have all of these terms listed. And you'll see that the target term itself has the highest weight or equal to, in this example, since star happened twice, it has a higher weight. If it had only happened once, cast would be the highest weight. It's the target term. So as terms are moving further away, the weight is lower. And then finally, for evaluating these frameworks, the researchers performed a comparative study with two other XML semantic retrieval frameworks, root path disambiguation, RPD, and versatile structure disambiguation, VSD. And you can see here that there are 4 groups of documents. In the upper left, you can see that XSDF, which is the blue bar, is very obviously has the highest F values, highest precision, highest recall compared to the other 2 frameworks. But then if you look at the bottom right, RPD, which is red, does the best. So what is the difference? The difference is that this new model, XSDF, performs really well compared to these other 2 with terms that are highly ambiguous. And in the bottom right, where it doesn't perform well, the documents in that group were made up of terms that were clear. They were already disambiguated. So this new model is particularly apt for XML that doesn't have clearly defined terms and is quite ambiguous with polysemy and those various the synonyms where it's not easy to tell what means what. I've listed references here. If you're interested in learning more, feel free to email me. I don't know if I can answer your questions. I'm still learning about this myself. I find it very interesting. And thank you.